Good evening to wherever you may be zooming in from. I'm Rachel Messerich, Programs Manager for the American Craft Council and the coordinator behind the American Craft Forum series. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to this American Craft Forums program in association with our quarterly magazine, American Craft. I'm speaking to you today from the American Craft Council in Minneapolis, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. This place carries a complicated and layered history. In the thousands of years, the Dakota and Ojibwe people have been in relationship and kinship with the land here. And in the several hundred years since European settlers colonized the land that the state of Minnesota now occupies, the United States land seizure was a project of destruction that denied the Dakota and Ojibwe free and unhindered access to land that fundamentally shapes their identity and lives. We pay tribute to the Dakota and Ojibwe and invite you to consider the land on which you live and the confluence of legacies that bring you to stand where you are, particularly through critical reflection and conversation with your own community. Fostering conversation and community are at the heart of ACC's mission, and American Craft serves as one of the most vital contributions in service to this mission, and hopefully to the field of craft and American culture. ACC's 80-plus-year-old publications contributes to the craft conversation by shining a light on the diversity, resilience, beauty, and impact of American craft and its makers. In 2025, we look at craft through the lens of 4 themes: interior, emerge, retreat, and adorn. The editorial team is just wrapping up the spring issue, Emerge, which will be hitting mailboxes in mid-February. Plans are well underway for the summer issue on Retreat. We encourage pitches and submissions from our community and have more information on the rest of the 2025 and coming up 2026 themes on our website. Please check under Writer's Guidelines for more information. Before I dive into the program and my introduction, I just wanted to thank the ACC staff, particularly our Executive Director, Andrea Specht, our Director of Programs and Events, Katie Johnson, our uber talented editorial team, our amazing marketing team, and our Director of Finance and Administration, Tracy Lamperty, who is taking the behind the scenes tech helm for today's program. The American Craft Council is a national nonprofit member-based organization. As such, I would also like to give a big shout out to our current donors and members who make programs like this possible, and a very special thank you to the Minnesota State Arts Board and Wingate Charitable Foundation for their generous support. For those considering membership, we welcome you to join us in our support of makers, our celebration of the handmade, and our connection to a vibrant craft community. ACC members receive a subscription to American Craft Magazine, complimentary tickets to our Baltimore Marketplace and other exclusive event benefits, professional development resources for artists through our Craft Lab workshop series. We just had our first workshop of that series actually last week, access to discounted travel and more. Visit our website. Links will be in the chat in a moment to get started and see how your support makes a difference and explore more ways to invest in the future of craft. Moving on to a few technical and logistical reminders. Please make sure that your camera is off and your audio is muted for the program and conversation. We encourage you to participate in the talk via the chat feature and drop any comments or questions there. Closed captioning is available during this program. On the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a closed caption symbol. Clicking that button will turn this feature on and off. This program will also be recorded and available for future viewing. From the amazing shops at Adelphi Paper Hangings, recreating historic block printed wallpapers, to LaToya Hobbs's powerful, larger-than-life work that finds much of its foundation in block printing, to the lovely ethereal paper quilts by Susanna Cromwell. Block printing appeared throughout the winter issue, not by design, but just by lovely happenstance. Today's conversation was inspired by this ancient printmaking art form, featuring a deeply craft-centered process of applying ink to hand-carved blocks that get stamped onto paper or textiles. To guide us through this conversation, I am so pleased to introduce our moderator, Laura Brown. Laura, if you want to turn on your camera at this point. Laura is a printmaker and textile artist who works with salvaged materials to make community-oriented artwork with a colorful and graphic sensibility. This takes the form of postcards, prints, quilts, and many other things that make people ask, is this art or is it a craft? Laura holds an MFA in studio art from University of Texas. She has been a resident artist at North House Folk School, Women's Studio Workshop, Minnesota Center for Book Arts, Kala Art Institute, and the Migrant Graphic in Norway. Her work appears in collections at Yale University and the Library of Congress, among others. Her work has been exhibited in many places, including the Soap Factory and the Minnesota Museum of American Art. She lives in Minneapolis and works as the partnership coordinator, and resident instructor at Minnesota Center for Book Arts. I'm now going to turn it over to Laura, who will welcome us and kick things off with short introductions by these incredible makers. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. I was introduced to American Craft magazine when I was an undergraduate, and my printmaking professor was the one that introduced me, and I've been a big fan ever since. And this issue is especially delightful, partly because of all of the block printing that is featured. So I'm really excited to be here and moderating this panel, and to just see such a variety of different techniques and perspectives represented by our artists. So we'll hear a little bit from each of them, and then we'll come back together for a conversation. And so, as Rachel said, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Susanna. So Susanna, if you want to share or turn your camera on, I will pass the baton over to you.
Hi, hello. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, my name is Susanna Lima Nobri Late Cromwell. I just add that my middle name's in there just because it's kind of my family history. I was born in Brockton, Massachusetts, and lived there until I was 21. And then since then, I've been in Hawaii. Right now, I'm on the island of Maui, where I live, and that's pretty significant because my work really is inspired by just the nature around us. Everything I do really starts in the jungle, in the water, or somewhere, and finding inspiration from there. On this first slide, you can see this is called a tea leaf. This is actually, I'm still working on it now, just printed it. And this one just came from my backyard. So the start of a lot of my work is just from going outside, and when I really feel a connection to something, deciding to bring it in and work with it or photograph it. On the next slide, let's see. Here is one of the blocks. I work predominantly with linoleum as my block. This is a larger piece. It's kind of linoleum's kind of stuck together. I also work with rubber, which I'm going to show you in a future. Let's see, we can go on the next slide and see. This is also linoleum. So here's another, just a shell I found by the ocean. I think if you read the article, you'll see that a lot of, when I try to find significance in what I'm going to feature, it's because of a moment. This shell was something I found in Lahaina before the fire. So that's why I chose it for a subject, and to really focus on this one item, which was, just in my car, but thought make it big and look at it longer. And on the next slide, with these, so I added this photo just to show the rubber. The last ones were linoleum. I also work with rubber. I found that rubber is really versatile. I can move it around, and move that. Sometimes I want that chatter in the background, sometimes I don't. So the rubber is something that I can use like puzzle pieces. And on the next slide, this is an
Oh,
example.
wow, look at this, huh?
Yeah, so this is an example of printing the rubber. And this just layering, I'll layer different, I use oil ink. So here's one. And on the next slide, this is printing. I print either when I use rubber, like the last one, it's most similar to maybe Indian block printing where you have separate blocks and then you layer. Where this one right now is actually a linoleum, and I use a more Japanese block printing. I don't have a press for these larger pieces. So what I do is I use a Japanese baron, and transfer. Most of my paper is Japanese, or there's also some, really I collect paper from all over the world, but that's one of my favorites. And then on the next slide, this is an example of the finished product. This is, earlier I showed some hibiscus flowers. This is a different hibiscus, but just an example of that layered rubber block, printed many times and then stitched together. That's where the three-dimensional craft area. So I create quilts using the prints that I have block printed. And then on the next slide, here's an example of, I actually print this 100 times for one of the pieces I recently made, cut them up into pieces and to panels, and then create a slide, just a quilt from that. And on the next slide, here it is finished. So here this is just lots of pieces, and this one I kind of cut them into shapes to mimic like tiles on a roof and kind of falling down. I looked at a big wall and a tree where the monstera kind of overlap each other and fall over each other, some dry in the back, some very much alive in the beginning, and I mimic that movement from nature. And then on the next slide, here's another example of a quilt made with the block printed panels. And one more slide. I think there's one more too. This is the finished product for the two that I had shown earlier. So there's a lolu, that's an endemic palm from Hawaii, and that's something I feature a lot here. And then the other one is opihi or limpets, and it's just a special culturally for Hawaii, and it's also special for my family's culture from Cape Verde. So it's something I really, really care about using in my art. And are there any more slides? I think that's it. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions later. And I'm going to turn it over now to Michele Farwell with Adelphi.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michele Farwell. I'm one of 4 printers here at Adelphi Paper Hangings. Thank you, Susanna, and thank you to Rachel and the American Craft Council for hosting this forum. And thank you to Tracy for running the slides for me, which we could start right now. Next slide. So we're a small wallpaper manufacturer located in Sharon Springs, New York, which is a town about an hour west of Albany, near Cooperstown. And the next slide is another picture of our shop. And then next slide. So our company began business in 1999 when Chris Orstrom, who's on the right, who has a passion for historic materials and techniques, And Steve Larson, who's on the left, who is an artist and had been using vintage wallpaper in his sculpture, decided to expand upon a historic block printed wallpaper demonstration project that the two had started at the Fenimore Farm and Country Village, which is a living history museum in Cooperstown, New York. And they decided to have a go and make it into a business. Next slide. So at Adelphi, we reproduce historic wallpaper patterns from the 18th to the 20th century, very much the same way that they were originally manufactured. Our wooden printing block surfaces are made of Swiss pear or cherry. And this one is got white ink on it. So the one departure from the traditional blocks is we have our blocks laser cut rather than hand carved. Next slide. We make all our paints at the shop. And so there's Steve making some paint. They're distemper paints, and we mix and color match by hand and eye. Next slide. This is Jen. She's applying the background color to a roll. So they're applied by brush to each 11-yard roll on a long grounding table. The next slide. It's just a close-up. And then the next 3 slides you can go through pretty quick. The blocks are positioned onto the paper and pressure is applied with a foot press and then hung to dry. And then our next slide. And then the next, sorry. All of our patterns that we offer are historic reproductions. We work from original documents, samples, and sometimes photographs to draft new pattern blocks. So this is a picture of me working, looks like from a photograph, drawing with marker onto Mylar. Next slide. So we take care to match our paints to the original colors. And when we do our restoration projects, our clients can be quite surprised sometimes to find the vibrance of the original. Unfaded and clean version. Next slide. And last one. So I began, oh, sorry, you can keep it up there. I began work at Adelphi in 2000. I came to the company with some coursework in art and design from Rhode Island School of Design, but most of my training has been on the job. This is our current team. There's 7 of us. Most of my colleagues also have a background in art. We learn from each other, and we've always got new projects to work on. With that, I'm going to turn the screen over to LaToya Hobbs.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just gonna get my slides together. So hi, everybody. My name is LaToya Hobbs. I identify myself artistically as a painter and printmaker. I'm originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, but I've been living and working in Baltimore, Maryland since 2013. I moved here to take a teaching position at the Maryland Institute College of Art. So yeah, I work a lot of different ways. I would say that a lot of my current work is kind of a combination of elements that I enjoy from both my painting practice and my printmaking practice. But before that, I kind of started more traditionally with printmaking. My undergraduate degree is in painting, but I decided to do printmaking for my MFA after falling in love with the medium. In particular, woodcut is what I focus on primarily in my printmaking practice. I also do monotype. I've done other processes, but the thing that I love most is relief. So here's an example of like the kind of typical traditional printmaking work that I do, meaning that I'm carving the block for the purpose of producing an editioned set of works on paper. From this image here, you can see that a lot of my work is figurative. I do a lot of kind of portraiture work. Now I'm kind of more interested in what I like to describe narrative portraiture. So putting people in places and environments that give you a little bit more insight into who they are. But I also include other things like color and texture and pattern is also really important in my work. Here's another example of one of my more traditional woodcuts. And so the previous image and this image were done like in graduate school. As I mentioned, I went to graduate school at Purdue University. And so from there, I kind of had some personal challenges. One of those was to really increase the scale of my work. So you can see with this image here, it's like 45 by 60. And then other challenges that I had was really thinking about ways that I can make my figurative work like more contemporary. And so we'll see kind of examples of that, my solution to that in just a moment. But I want to fast forward to this image just to kind of give you an example of some of my current work. So even though I'm really interested in working in like mixed media, again, combining elements of my painting and printmaking practice together, I still do editions where I'm working in a traditional sense of like carving a block to produce an edition of works on paper. So this is a more recent work. This was done in 2023. So I'm going to show this work next. This work is super important to me because I think it was the first iteration of the type of work that I'm doing now. So as I mentioned before, in graduate school, I was looking for ways to kind of really push myself, to make myself more contemporary, but also to really stay true to the things that I really enjoy. So I kind of started just doing everything that I enjoy on the same surface. So this is a mixed media piece. It's on a wood panel. I think this is MDF because that's what I could afford at the time. But you can see there's like lots of different elements there. There's carving there. I took like old prints that didn't work out and used them for collage. There's painting there. So all these different modalities that are happening and coming together and working together in the piece. So I would say that this, and I had a few other works in the same manner, but they're kind of the first iteration or the precursors to the type of work that I'm doing. And so now I'll fast forward to this piece, which is more in the line of what my current practice is. So I'm really interested in this idea of the matrix as art object. And so sometime like during the process where I was really investigating woodcuts, I discovered that I really liked the matrix more than I liked my works on paper. So I thought the printed work was beautiful, but I was just so attached to the block, or I had so much like admiration for the block. And that could be just because you spend so much time working on the block that you kind of create, at least for myself, I kind of created attachment to it. But right now I kind of primarily work on wood surfaces, and I like that because it gives me the flexibility to work with a lot of different techniques and materials. So I can carve into the surface, I can collage into it, I can paint on it, so I can do everything on the same surface. So this piece is titled The Lioness. It's not a print, it's actually a mixed media painting. So again, I'm like directly carving into the surface of these wood panels, and then again, bringing these other techniques and other processes again. So I kind of like the challenge of taking these very different things and having them exist all on the same surface together. Okay, this example here is titled Flourish. And again, it kind of exemplifies, again, this idea of matrix as art objects. It also kind of shows like the different ways that I work. So this is acrylic on carved wood panels, and the type of wood that I prefer to use is cherry. So this is carved in the same manner that I would carve a block if I was going to be printing it. But for my purposes, like, it's not intended to be printed for me, the carving is kind of the forefront, and I'm presenting this as like a painting. To me, I would describe this as a mixed media painting, even though it's very much steeped in kind of my traditional mindset and things of how I work as a printmaker. So I'm taking the carving technique, which is the thing that I love most about my identity as a printmaker. I love the carving process. So I'm taking that and then coupling it with my sensibility and how I think about image formation, like as a painter. So this next slide just kind of shows you a little bit of my process. So this is me in the studio, kind of in the early stages of working on this piece. Most of my works now, as I mentioned, I only work on wood panels, whether I'm doing a print edition or if I'm making a mixed media piece. So I usually do a layer of black paint on the panels first. Then I do a really detailed drawing in water-soluble white pencil. And then from there, I kind of start the carving process. So you can see little bits of each step in the process from this slide. And then I just have another image here kind of this work in the gallery space, also again, to kind of give you a sense of the scale of the work. And then the last one that I'm going to share with you, this is a current work titled Pinnacle. One of my favorite pieces. It's still very much steeped in, again, this process of my identity as a painter and a printmaker, but kind of bringing a little bit more color back into the work. For a period of time, I was working exclusively like in black and white, or even in my mixed media works, I had like very limited color palettes. And some of the larger, really large carved pieces, they were just, again, monochromatic. That's something that I personally really enjoy. But I also like to work in color too. So this piece is titled Pinnacle. It's a portrait of my husband and two sons. But it starts, again, the same way. So I'm going to show this slide again to just give you a little bit of insight into the process. But it starts the same way with the flat black paint, pencil drawing to get all my details and composition laid out. And then from there, I kind of start laying in color. And then carving is the last thing that usually happens. But with this piece, and I'll show this detail, I kind of wanted to work the panels like they're a woodcut, but also like an etching at the same time. So I did all the carving, but then in certain areas, I pushed ink into the lines, not ink, but paint into the lines that I carved, wiped it clean a little bit and then inked it up again, like I would roll up a wood block to kind of bring back some of the black detail lines. So it worked in that way. It's kind of this push and pull. So I'm working as a painter, I'm thinking about like a relief printmaker, but then also thinking about it like an etching, kind of all in the same boat. So here is an image of the full works. Again, just to give you a sense of the scale. And so I really even increased the scale more than what I was doing in graduate school. I would say around 2020 was when I did this. My largest work to date is titled Carving Our Time. And so it was a work made of 5 different scenes, but each of those scenes was 8 feet tall and 12 feet wide. And so I really enjoyed that scale. So now I continue to work in that scale. So yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing because that's my last slide. And I'm going to invite the rest of the panelists to join me on the screen.
Well, I love hearing a little bit about everyone's work, and I'm sure that that's a great introduction in case anyone is coming in the audience who hasn't heard about everyone's work. I'll just start off with a couple of questions that everyone can maybe speak to. And again, audience members, if you've got questions that you want to put in the chat, I will take a look at those, and we'll have time for audience Q&A at the end. So we welcome those questions, and I'll just get the ball rolling. So as a printmaker, I'm always curious to know from other folks, what is your favorite? No, that's not the question I want to ask. We're going to start over. This is the question I want to ask. And it's about scale, because it seems to be a really important part to everybody's work. And so you can kind of speak to this, whatever kind of comes to mind first, or how you handle scale, or how it like maybe artwork has grown over the years. But if each of you could just maybe talk a little bit about how you handle scale in your work, I would love to hear more about that. Maybe even like the physicalities. I'm thinking about like the process of how you make big or small things, practicalities, physicalities, things like that.
Hi. So for me, I'm taking certain blocks, whether they be this big or large, and repeating them over and over and over. I like the scale to be large enough for you to feel like you can go in, and I want it to be kind of like this mind labyrinth. In my intention, I don't want someone to see it all in the same time. I want them to sit and follow a stitch for a while. A lot of what I feature are just really simple everyday items that you could see, on the side of the road or in the grass. So I think that if I make them huge, you see them, and if I repeat them, you see them more. Yeah, my skill just comes from repetition and repeating that printmaking process over and over and over. There are times when I will just do, the single edition print, whether they're small or very large in scale, or I'm actually just carving a large block for a long time. But that the majority of the paper quilts are really just a large block or small block that's been repeated over and over again to create that large size in the finished piece.
I can talk next. I can say that I've always enjoyed working large. Even before I was like doing printmaking, like just an undergrad, I was the student always bringing like gigantic things to painting class. So yeah, I feel like that's kind of a personal strength of mine. But I will say, I think for artists, like a lot of the decisions that we make about size and scale is really like the space that we have to work in. Very practical things like the space that we have to work in, or like the size of press that we have access to. So in some of those earlier images that I showed, I worked that size because that was the largest size that I could fit on the press that I had access to at Purdue. And then for even larger than that, like I think during that time, like 2012, 2013, the largest size that I had done like at that time was like an 8x4 foot, but that was just because I was getting stuff from Home Depot. I can cut it into 3 sections to fit it in my car to get it to campus. And, I can put those 3 pieces together. I would print them separately and then put them together to make a larger thing. So sometimes it's just very practical things of like what you can afford, what you can afford to ship, what can you afford to have framed. So you're always thinking about those things. But I think from a conceptual standpoint, for me, the scale kind of reflects my admiration for the subjects, the people that I'm portraying in my work. And since I've been kind of doing this more, I guess I like to call it narrative portraiture. So a lot of my earlier pieces were just kind of bust portraits where you just see like the person, their physicality, you can see their hair, their earrings, their adornment. But I want to put them in environments and spaces so you can really get a better idea of who they are, because I think we know so much about people through the spaces that they occupy. So yeah, the scale really lends itself for that. Kind of like Susanna was saying that you want people to be in the work, like literally and figuratively. So if I'm doing an interior space, I want that space to be expansive, to feel like you're in that space with the person. But yeah, I love working large. I think that's kind of my strength. But at the same time, I'm also trying to learn to scale back and do smaller work. So that's kind of a personal challenge for me. Like I feel like working on an 8x10 is like kryptonite for me. I'm like, how do I work on this tiny space? So that's a personal challenge that I have working. But yeah, I think I just, in general, just love love working at a large scale.
Okay, thanks, LaToya. That was interesting. For us, the scale is really constrained a lot by we're using all historic patterns. So, and they were constrained by paper size and by block size as well. So for our blocks, we tend to, we're limited to about 22 inches by 22 inches. We have a few that are a bit larger. So that's scale in terms of printing size and blocks, but then there's also the other scale of the pattern size. So, you know, we can have pretty large patterns up to 48-inch repeats. And they have a much different effect on a wall in an interior than a small little sprig where, you know, maybe the scale is 2-inch diamond or something like that. So scale kind of works two ways for us in wallpaper.
And then there's the repetition over, I would imagine that it, like the repetition over time that you may not even see completely manifested in the studio, but then you get the pattern up on a wall as a part of a whole design concept in a room.
It's very fun to watch. Some, you know, we get used to just looking at our long, narrow rolls. And then when you do see them on the wall where you can, the pattern will change sort of in your eye, where your eye goes and how you read the pattern can change. So it's always fun for us. We're mostly, you know, just looking at single rolls. It's fun for us to see finished rooms, things like that.
Do you get to see a lot of those rooms in person, or is it mostly like images of the rooms?
It's, yeah, generally images. Yeah.
Okay, nice.
We're mostly just shipping out from here.
Yeah, interesting. I'm wondering, Susanna, if you can talk a little bit about how the sewing and the cutting. I'm also a quilter, and so I think a lot about sort of these questions of scale and how to increase or decrease. And that's like a strategy I sometimes use. And so I'm curious about how did the sewing enter the picture for you? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for one, I'm always drawn to three-dimensional art, whether it's pottery or textile design, textile pieces. So I was printmaking and feeling like it was flat for me, and I really desired that texture. So some of it started from just this desire to go beyond that one dimension, but the other part is just messing up actually. And so creating a print and being like, oh, everything's good except for that one time that I pressed, because I am pressing, you know, in repetition. I'm not doing one large print and pull many times. So I could be there for a whole day printing, and then one little little peehee is off, and I don't like that one. So I started with just thinking, I'll just cover it up with a new one, you know, and I'll patch that area. And then, you know what, let me patch here and here and here. And the other thing is, just for years, I've had this like container where my husband, whenever I would cut out this like aloha print kind of thing and frame it, I'd have these strips and he'd always stick them in something. And after a while, I just started to think like, I like this bag, you know, like, of stuff and all the colors. Why don't I stick them together and see what happens? And so that's one. The other thing is what LaToya was saying is space. I started on a kitchen table. And so if I wanted a large piece, I couldn't really just print a large piece. I'd have to print 100 small pieces and stick them together, you know. So that was something I could do when I wanted to go big. So excuse me. So yeah, so that was just the space. I use Japanese block printing. Someone asked, what am I carving on? I'm either carving on linoleum. So it's Japanese block printing in the sense of how I get the pull and how I get the print. But linoleum or rubber so that I can be stamping, really. That's what I'm doing, rolling it on, rolling the oil paint, and pressing over and over and over again in order to create these patterns. And what I found is that if if I have a commission for this big, or if I have a commission for a whole wall, I can just keep going, and then the paper, Japanese paper or whatever papers I'm using are usually 24 by 36-ish. So that felt limiting. So that was another thing I wanted to go beyond and think, okay, well, what if I wanted a 6 foot by 6 foot piece? I can just stick it together. I can use that by, maybe some rice paste, or I can stitch them together and add some more. Or maybe I want 5 pieces of paper, some are see-through, some are not, and I want them to all be layered so that I can see different levels and even what's behind the first paper. I often flip my paper upside down and use the backs of my paper. So that's where the texture and the sewing came, is just kind of playing, really just like crinkling it up, pulling it out, and layering. And I'm trying to always be in that state of playing and not thinking, okay, this is what I do now. This is my art form looks like this, rather than it's like on the next day, I might, throw some clay on top of it, whatever it is, throw some beads and just keep growing, rather than feeling like I'm stuck in the stitching just came from that, from just wanting to have more from that. Yeah.
And the impulse of like not wanting to waste the parts that are good, but also not wanting to show the mistake you made. I love that. So actually, my friend Jenna is here and asked a great question in the chat for LaToya about your exhibition at the, it's related to a question that I had for you, because after having seen your work and thinking sort of subconsciously in the past, thinking like, that is so much carving, which is not my personally favorite part of the printmaking process. And just thinking like, you have to really like carving to make these images. But Jenna went to see your exhibition at the Milwaukee Art Museum and sent me this beautiful video of the prints on one side of the room and the blocks on the other, I believe. And so just one of the questions is similar to hers, which is like, were the blocks always intended to be carved, or like how do these decisions come through to like either exhibit both, or the print matrix like you were talking about versus the final print? Can you talk a little bit more about those decisions? You're muted.
Yeah. So the work that, for those who in the audience who may not be familiar, the work that they're referring to is called Carving Out Time. It was a work I did over the course of the pandemic from like 2020 to 2021, so almost a year. And it's basically a woodcut that takes you through a day in my life as a mom and artist. So it's one work, but it's in 5 parts. So I call them scenes. So we have a morning scene, time with me and my husband, with me and my children, doing homeschool, dinner time, putting the boys to bed, and then I finally get to take off mom hat and be an artist and be in the studio. So the idea for that work, it was always meant to be like, it was going to be a mixed media work. Like the prints were not a part of the initial thought process. Because around this time, again, I was really excited about just doing these mixed media pieces. I mean, I was still doing my traditional printmaking work here and there, but I was really excited about this new, I like to call them hybrid works, where they, again, take elements of my printmaking painting, but putting them together in what I hope to be a seamless way, like flowing between all these things. So my idea was to do like a mixed media piece. So it's going to be some collage in there and some color and all this stuff. And so, so it was, printing them was never a part of my original concept. And so that was like the thing that I, told the curator about, who invited me to be a part of the exhibition that they debuted in at the Baltimore Museum of Art. But my husband, his name is Harrison Jacks. He's also an artist. After I can't remember if it was before I finished carving the first scene or if it was after. I think it was before, like when I was doing the planning. He was like, hey, you know, I don't normally tell you what to do in your practice and in your work, but like I really think you should print your panels as well. And I was like, no, it's supposed to be a mixed media painting. It's not, you know. But eventually, like I listened, and so it kind of changed the way I thought about carving the works, like when I started, because normally when I'm doing a mixed media piece and I'm going to collage a pattern that I've printed over something, I don't carve that area because it's just going to be covered up, right? But when I made the decision to have prints of the work of the panels, I had to really think about the carving and activate everything, right? Because whatever you don't carve is just going to be a blank space. So I had to think about the work in two ways. I had to think about the wood blocks, and then I had to think about the secondary work, which were the prints. It also made me like have decisions about like reversing. And so since the panels were always meant to be the original idea, I let those be the right way, so to speak. And so that's why there's not any text in the piece at all. Like there's a scene, the second scene of the work is in the office. There's diplomas on the wall and books. So I purposely didn't put any text because I didn't want the text to be correct one way and then backwards another way. So yeah, I just kind of said in my mind that like the blocks are the primary thing, the primary work, and then the prints are the secondary thing. So, but the decision to print them came a little bit later in the planning process. Now, last year was a good year for that work. The blocks were acquired by the Baltimore Museum of Art, but they were lent out to a couple institutions last year. So the blocks were shown at the First Art Museum earlier in the year in Nashville, Tennessee. And then with the prints, I had an edition of 2 and then an artist proof that I kept for myself. So Harvard Art Museum acquired a set of the edition. So they had an exhibition earlier in the year. It opened like February and ended in like, I want to say March or something like that. And then the latest exhibition was at the Milwaukee Art Museum. So they had the idea of putting both things together. Because up at that point, they either saw the panels or you saw the prints. Like no one had ever shown them together. And so they wanted people to get a really like good idea of like the process. Because some people still didn't understand that like these works on paper were from like actual blocks. Some people who didn't know printmaking, they were like, are these like big photocopies or are these? I'm like, no, the blocks are this actual size. So the Milwaukee show was the first iteration of an exhibition where they had them together. And so they were in a long exhibition hall. So the prints were all on one side and then the panels were all on the other side. And then I don't know, it gave you again, this like aha moment, like, oh, okay, I understand why they're reversed now. Or yeah, just kind of give you like a full circle of like the whole process. So
Yeah. Amazing. Thanks for explaining that and just talking us through those decisions. There's a question. I have questions for Michele about color. Partly, you showed the image of the original color. In your slides, you shared about like the original color and you had it next to the really faded wallpaper sample. So thinking about, this is actually another question that arose in the chat. Like, how can you tell what the original color was? And then also in the article in the magazine, it talks about working with a designer to make the historical patterns in contemporary colors and working with those. And so I guess, can you talk to us about like the process of mixing the colors and how, you know, like how you know what those historical colors would have been after you've looked at faded things, or and can you talk a little bit about the mixing new colors that are not necessarily part of the original
Yeah,
the
sure.
original historical colors?
Sure. So when we are coming up with our document colorway, the historic colorway, which is always the first one that we offer in our line, and when we're working on special projects with institutions and things. We like to be able to work from the originals as much as possible. And a lot of times they are, the paper was applied to a box or a hat box or a trunk, the inside of a trunk. We're really happy when it's on the inside of a trunk, because then it was protected from sunlight and fading. So a lot of times we can find vibrant colors in there. Sometimes we're searching for the unfaded version between the seams of the papers. If we can't get those, we will sometimes get the paint samples analyzed to tell us what pigments were used in the originals, and work with colors that way. And the final way to get at the colors is just knowing what historic pigments were available at the time, because for people have had red ochre and yellow ochre, red iron oxide, yellow ochre, carbon black, lead white for a long time. So we can make guesses that way. We know, what time period various pigments were made available. So that's how we go about coming up with our document colorways. And then we also offer, for each of our patterns, each of our historic patterns, we offer another colorway that is historically based. So it's historically feasible. It uses pigments that were available at the time. Generally, we've seen a historic sample in similar colors. And then we also offer 2 more colorways, and those we come up with ourselves, so sort of anything goes. And that is one of the things I enjoy the most. It's one of our chances here to be creative. But in addition to that, we work with designers, because each of our orders are made to order. We don't have stock. Designers can see a pattern that they like, but recolor them to whatever they specify. So designers will send us paint chips, or we have our own little color books that they can choose from, and we'll match to the paint chip. And we generally do a little test, a 4 or 5 foot long test of the colors they want to try out with our patterns, and send it back to them for approval. Sometimes it'll take 2 or 3 tries to get what they want. And that's always a fun process to see how other people see our patterns and imagine them in new ways. So, and one of the most adventurous people was highlighted in the book, Kelly Cadillac, who has used pigments that were definitely not available in the early 1800s. But that was also fun and challenging for us to try to figure out what, and Steve is the one who generally does most of our color matching, to figure out, where do I even start to get that, bright magenta color or deep purple. So.
Yeah, and then how does color fastness figure into all of this?
Well, so the pigments we use now are all color fast. We do make all of our own paints. So we start with water, chalk, clay, and then our binder is acrylic, which is a departure from the original paints, which the binder would have been animal hide glue binder. That's very fussy to work with, and we decided to make a concession to modern day and use acrylic binder, thankfully. But so to that, that's our paint base, and then to that we add our pigments. And our pigment company assures us they're light fast, so that's what I can tell you about that. But that is part of with the historic documents that we get. Like, we also know sort of which pigments lasted longer than others. That can sort of give us a clue as well about what colors might have, that pink we're seeing was actually maybe much more peach, but the yellow faded kind of idea.
Yeah, interesting. All right, just checking out our time here. We're getting close to wrapping up. So I'll ask you, Michelle, I'll ask you another question that came up in the chat, which is, how do you register those long repeat patterns? How do you do the registration for that?
So on the edge of each of our blocks is a set of pins or nails, and we start with the first color that we're going to apply in the pattern. We'll have the pins that set it up for the rest of each additional color, and we use the edge of the paper as our guide for where we're going to set the pins. I know that it kind of looks like magic, but it's not magic at all.
Don't be fooled, anybody. Not magic. It's just
not magic. It's
precision, plan.
Pins.
Yeah. So we've kind of talked about repetition a little bit, and I'm just curious if you all have thoughts about how the repetition of doing something over and over again has maybe affected your practice or your thoughts about printmaking, or maybe it's like a metaphor for other things in your life. But how does like the act of doing something over and over again, like what does that do for your craft and creative processes? Is that too like out there of a question?
No, I don't. I'll just go first, but I'm interested to hear what everyone else has to say. That it's something I think about quite a bit as I print repeat after repeat. But I think for me that is where how you sort of hone your skills, how you get better in your craft is to do it over and over again. And so one of the things I really like about printmaking is the immediacy of it, right? You have a blank page and then you apply your block and pick it back up and it's all right there. And then when you do it again, you advance the paper, you do it again, you sort of get a chance to learn from each image that you've created what you could do the next time to make it just a little bit better. Do I change where I apply my pressure? Do I change how much paint I've put in my sieve? Do I press a little harder, a little lighter for a longer period of time? So for me, that iterative process, I think, is kind of where the craft comes in, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I feel like I'm able to carve now and just have that be a meditative process, and it's something I enjoy because my hands can work in, fine motor skills without really panicking that I might mess up. So now it's gotten into a point where I'm just having fun because of that repetition. At the same time, my attention is very so I tend to have one piece in the drawing process, one in about to be printed, and I have Ziploc bags in my purse of ribbons that I'm going to be stitching during soccer practice or something. So a lot of times I want that repetition for comfort, but I also really enjoy being like, I'm bored and I'm going to that one now, you know? So I guess the repetition is developing that comfort, but then I also look forward to the different parts of the process so that it doesn't get too repetitive. You know, it's like I'm gonna go do this all day again. So, and I feel like that's something with everyone here. Like I know with LaToya, it sounds like there's so many different parts with your, you know, with your turning, so like there's the history part of it for you. And, you know, so it sounds like for everyone there are so many different parts that it is repetitive, but a little bit different than when I was like painting before, you know, where I'm not sitting in a chair at all moments doing the same kind of movement. There is a different movement. And yeah, to create mixed media printmaking.
Yeah, so I think in order to be a printmaker, you do have to enjoy doing the same thing over and over again in some capacity. And I think part of that is like where the discipline comes from. And I think when people look at my work on these large scales, the time question always comes up, like spending so much time. Like you have to, again, really enjoy it to be able to spend that much time with these little tools doing this over and over again on a surface. But I like what you said, Susanna, about it being a contemplative process. So if I get to a place in my work where I'm either just like carving out a pattern, there's not a lot of things that I have to think about because my drawing is already set. So it's just me clearing out space. Yeah, it is very kind of a contemplative thing, and you kind of get in the zone and get in a rhythm and get in a pattern. I think about that in terms of like printing and addition as well. I call it like, I think about it as like choreography, right? Me setting my choreography for this print to get it done. And so the troubleshooting, the proofing, testing out the ink, that's like me planning the choreography and changing things. And then once I get the good print, then the choreography is set, right? And so like, you know, if you're at dance practice, you learn the routine and you do the routine the same way each time. So I think about that same sense when I'm printing in the studio. So it's like the same way I'm moving around, like I have to organize things a certain way so that I can easily flow from one thing to the next. And it's almost kind of robotic in a way, but I like to think about it as choreography because I like to dance. But I think that same like sense of repetition, especially with printmaking, like you have to do this first and then this first and then this first and then that. So I bring that into the studio even when I'm doing my mixed media pieces because I like to have multiple pieces going at a time. So I kind of do that same thing, even though they're different images. Um, I'll like, let me prep all my surfaces first. Once all the surfaces are prepped, let me do all my drawings. Once the drawings are done, then I'll go and lay in all the backgrounds. Then I'll do all the patterns on all of them. So that same like repetition of doing things in an order, in a flow, I think it just helps me, yeah, in my productivity and even like at home and stuff too. Like there's always an order of operations to the things I do, whether I'm like prepping food to cook or even like how I structure my classes when I'm teaching. There's always like this. And I think like order is something that I do well. It's how organizing information, and you have to think about that same thing in terms of like process. So I feel like the process of me being a printmaker seeps into other things, or maybe that was a part of me. That's why I'm drawn to printmaking. It could be vice versa. So
Yeah, chicken and egg. Like I feel like printmakers tend to have some traits of like caring about that order or the precision or the things like that a little bit more. Well, we're nearing the end of our conversation. So if anyone has any more questions from the audience, we'd love to have them in the chat. Or if any of you have questions for each other, I also want to make room for that. If there's something you've wanted to hear but haven't, or if there's anything that you wanted to say that I haven't asked you already, feel free to jump in with any of those things. Just give us a little minute.
I just want to say that was really impressed with both of your work that you do from the magazine and then looking up your websites and all, just thinking like, whoa, these people are legit. So
Thank
so
you for all of
I'm super stoked on everything I see.
Yeah, thank you. I feel the same way. I just, yeah, the patterns that you do, and I'm kind of personally into like incorporating like flowers and foliage in my work right now because flowers are kind of a form of self-care for me. I love plants. I can't grow them, unfortunately. But yeah, so I looking at all the different motifs and the vegetation in your work, it does have this like really like calming and relaxing type of effect. And so I was curious with your work because you describe a lot of them as quilts. Um, is that, does that apply to like how they function, or is it more about the process of how you put it together? It's akin to how a quilter would work.
Yeah. I don't wear them or anything, but I do just look at them as quilting because I'm taking lots of patches and pieces and just stitching them together so they're physically held together by string. So that's where the quilting term comes into. Um, some of them are a little different where the string is just ornamental. So I have a large piece and I'm just adding string here and there just for ornamental sake. Usually I don't call that quilts, even though they're technically probably still, but so I think that answers, yeah.
Well, and you use some like bookbinding stitches too, right? Like there's some that are joined together that like it kind of looks like there's maybe a spine of a book.
Yeah, well, I mean, this one
Using
right
that
here,
term
that's kind of,
loosely.
I use coaching. So
Yeah.
I'm wrapping rope with the papers. And that's like the kind of thing I'd have in my purse is just lots of rope and I'm wrapping the papers up and stitching them together and then using those long ribbons, I'll call them, to piece other larger pieces together. It's, and different papers react differently. Some of them, if I poke, it'll just like run, where others I can wrinkle. Some, if I wrinkle, they're not coming, they're just gonna rip. Some I need water to rip, some a razor, some just by hand. Yeah, so that it's a lot of the papers, even though they're all paper and not fabric, some react more like fabric and some are very much not fabric. So I have to pre-poke them and then come in with string afterwards because that's how I can keep them from, tearing in the wrong way. So yeah.
Michelle, I was gonna ask, you like after you do the printing process and everything is dry, does it some type of like finishing coat go on top of the the wallpaper?
Yeah, and generally no. So we end up with a very matte surface. The amount of chalk and clay that we have in our paint, there's really no sheen to it all. And if we sometimes we'll apply like a light varnish or something if we're making a screen or something, we were like a box, covered box. Those things are things we rarely do here anymore. But we don't put any coatings on the top. I had a question for you about the process of printing once you make these really large blocks or wood carvings. Are you applying the paper on top, laying the paper on top like Susanna does, or how do you have a big press, or how do you make your prints?
Yeah, so aside from the really large piece that I was talking about with carving out time, aside from that, I print all of my work myself. There's only been a couple times where I had somebody else print for me. But yeah, it's a little bit more like, yeah, it's all done like the same like traditional printmaking process. So you make your registration, plates. If it's a large thing that's covering the whole press bed, I just use the bed as my registration. So I'll use tape to mark where my block goes, and I'll use tape to mark where the paper goes. I'll load the paper on the press, roll it back, and then put the block, you know, the inked up block, and then just put the paper over and run it through the press. And so I like to be able to do stuff by myself, even though I'm like working really large. So I kind of have to, you know, come up with things that you probably shouldn't do. Like you probably shouldn't, students, like if you're here, don't be taping up the press bed. But but I do that just to make it easier. Obviously, if they're smaller blocks, then I get a proper registration board to mark out all that stuff. But with the larger pieces, they were printed by Big Ink. They have if you're not familiar with them, they are a group where they basically go around and do like woodcut workshops, like relief workshops. And so they invite people to print large scale blocks, and then they'll set up at like an art center or something like that. And then they'll just like have 2 fun days printing large blocks. And so their press can come apart. It's mobile. They have like a 8-foot press. Yeah. So it's can come apart, and then they put it together wherever they're going to set up. So my husband, we had both done workshops with them in the past. And so my husband like suggested that we ask them if they would just do what they would do for a workshop, but for me in my studio. So we hired them to do that for us. Thankfully, they said yes. I don't think they would do it again because it was a lot of work. So yeah, they literally set up the press in Baltimore here. There were some empty rooms in my studio, and so they set it up there and they printed. So yeah. But if you go to my YouTube page, LaToya M Hobbs Studio, there's a video on it called Carving LaToya M Hobbs Carving Out Time. So my husband, he did a lot of recording me like behind the scenes to kind of document the process of making that work. So if you want to see it and see more about the process, and there's clips of them printing the blocks too, so you can watch out that short video. It's like 11 minutes long.
Very cool. And are you still printing on paper when it's that big, or okay.
Yeah,
Amazing.
so I prefer like cotton papers. For the most part, I use a lot of I don't know, well, it depends. Like if I'm printing something by hand or if I have access to a press, so it kind of depends. But for that one, the largest roll that we were able to find to accommodate that size of the block was it was an Fabriano academic roll, I think, from Talus, I believe. And so that was, you know, doing research on my own and also research with recommendations from the founder of Big Ink. We came to the conclusion that would probably be the best size. It could accommodate, you know, the size of the blocks. A lot of the Japanese papers were like too short or not wide enough. So that was a cotton paper that suited the needs for the project.
Cool. Well, this has just been a really great conversation. I've loved hearing everyone's perspective and about your processes. And it's almost 7:15. I'll invite Rachel back to kind of, unless anyone has anything else you want to ask or share. I think I kind of wove everyone's chat questions into my questions.
Thanks, y'all. I'm just hopping in to say thank you to everybody for attending this evening. Thanks to all of our wonderful speakers and conversationalists. This was an amazing kind of dive into block printing and how that incredible practice kind of takes different forms in different artist practices. And so just really thanks to everybody for being here. It was lovely. And we wish you the best evening, and stay tuned for more forums coming up. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.